Good afternoon, everybody. I am Dr. Jenkins. I'm the Library Director here at Townsend Library in MSU Alamogordo. And today, for our Lunch and Learn lecture series, we have Reverend Vernon Robinson. Reverend Robinson is currently the pastor of Owen Chapel AME Church in Alamogordo. He was appointed to this position in November of 2003. He's married to Dr. Paulette Hilton Robinson and has 2 children. Reverend Robinson was born and raised in Portland, Oregon. He's been active in the community here, serving as local president of the Otero County NAACP, United Way of Otero County, Rotary Club of Alamogordo, the Alamogordo Public Library, and chaplaincy of GCRMC. He was ordained into the ministry in 1997 and has served in Oregon, California, Nevada, and New Mexico. He's going to be speaking to us today about the importance of the church in the African American community, with a special emphasis on the AME Church. So I'd like you to welcome Reverend Robinson today, and thank you for being here. It's all yours.
Thank you. Actually, it's all ours. But thank you for this opportunity to present this perspective on the Black church experience. I'll be speaking a lot from my experience of being raised in the church and traveling in the church. And so a lot of my comments, a lot of my insight will be personal. I was a church kid. On Sunday morning when we got up, there was no question. We got ready, we got dressed, and went to church. There's no, I don't feel like it, I don't feel good today, I don't want it. You got up and you went to church. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, thou who hast by thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in the path, we pray. Lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee, lest our hearts drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee. Shadowed beneath thy hand, may we forever stand, true to our God, true to our native land. Lift every voice and sing, till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty, lest our rejoicing rise high as the listing sky. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. They sing the rising sun of our new day begun. Let us march on till victory is won. Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the days when hope unborn had died, yet with a steady beat have not our weary feet come to a place for which our fathers sighed. We have come over a way that with tears has been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered. Out of the gloomy past till now we stand at last, where the white gleam of our bright star is cast. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, thou who brought us thus far on the way, thou who hast by thy the light. Keep us forever in the path we pray. Lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee. Lest our heart, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee. Shadowed beneath thy hand, may we forever stand, true to our God, true to our native land. What I just sang for you was actually a poem written by James Weldon Johnson. And if you check in the history of literature, James Weldon Johnson was a prolific writer. This is what he's most famous for, but he has several publications. And Dr. Jenkins can help you look them up. Prolific writer. The poem was made into a song and became known as the National Negro Anthem. And my parents and many of their generation, when this song was sung, they stood up and everybody sang it. And if you didn't have any music, you did it like I did, a cappella. That's just what you did. And there was a great sense of pride that went along with that. That oral tradition I'm going to share with you a little bit today. How did we get here? An estimated 12 to 20 million Africans were stolen out of the continent of Africa from 1450 to 1900. We can't account for the exact numbers. We can only estimate how many people were taken. All the records we don't have our hands on. But the slave trade in the 14th, 15th, 16th, and 17th, and 18th century was notorious. It brought millions of people from sub-Saharan Africa to North and South America in the lucrative business of economic trade. The triangle of commerce from Europe, Africa, and the Americas was known as the Middle Passage and saw the greatest migration of chattel capital in recorded history. 12 to 20 million people were taken out of Africa. And I say taken out because many of them did not make it. At least 20% of them never made it here. They died in transit in what we call the Middle Passage. In England, they had goods that were made. They were brought down to the coast of West Africa and they were traded for slaves. The trade brought the slaves generally to South America and to the Caribbean to be exchanged for indigo and sugarcane and rum. And then they went back to England and again loaded their ships. And so you had this triangle, this Middle Passage for 400 years that brought people out of Africa. I know the Holocaust was horrible in Europe, but this didn't even touch what happened to the African slave. A tremendous excavation of human chattel and property were taken. And to this day, the African American community, those people from the African diaspora are still suffering because it was such a horrendous act perpetrated by the capitalists in Europe, collaborated with blacks and whites and Arabs in Africa, and then perpetuated by traders and settlers who came to the Americas to make a lot of money. The reason that the slave trade was so important is because when settlers came to the Americas, Columbus and the explorers, they brought many diseases from Europe. And so when they tried to enslave the Indians sick. They couldn't take the smallpox, they couldn't take many of the European diseases. The African not only resisted many of the diseases, but thrived even through the Middle Passage. and was an excellent worker. Again, being agrarian based, many of them had knowledge of plants, had done farming, had done work with crops, and had that knowledge to do that. And so when the Indians died out, the Europeans contracted to have more and more slaves from Africa brought. That was an economic fact. The Indians could not survive what they had to go through, and so they had to bring the Africans. Some of you know this, some of you are very conscious. The conditions on many of these slave ships was just horrendous. People were brought like chattel. They were chained together and stuck together as many as they can get on there. The first 100 years, people died from diseases. They didn't keep the ships clean. Disease was rampant. Many of them went crazy, staying locked up or chained in the bottom of ships with excessive heat, without chance for sanitation, without medicine or proper food. Many of them died or went crazy. And the amazing thing is that many of them got a chance to jump off the ship, they would jump off. They would rather die rather than live in the conditions that they had to endure. So, this song that I sang for you is a glimpse of a summary of what African peoples had to go through. It was a nightmare. It was great degradation in spite of the conditions. The poet at the end encourages what? Lift your voices and sing. No matter how bad it was, he says to sing. Well, psychologists and behaviorists tell us today, if you will clap your hands, if you will stomp your feet, if you find something to sing about, you will be healthier. This was the tradition of many African people, where rhythm and singing and dance was a part of what they were doing. So this son of a slave said, lift your voices and sing. Don't let what happened in the past, no matter how horrible it is, sing. Find something good to sing about. Maybe it was that the Africans, once learning about the Hebrew Scriptures, understood after reading the book of Daniel that other people had suffered too. The Jews in Jerusalem were taken out of Jerusalem and taken to Babylonia. They were strangers in a strange land and were in exile for several hundreds of years. But they did not give up hope. They did not lose their faith. They did not stop from praising their Creator. They let their voices sing. And so maybe the African learned that other people could overcome. And so they were willing to do the same thing. In the movie Amistad, which I highly recommend, there's a scene in there where an African now is looking at Jesus on the cross. One of my favorite parts of the movie. And he realizes, oh, this man suffered. He had suffered, but he realized that other people had suffered too. But yet in all of his suffering, he was willing not only to forgive, but to give his life for others. So many of the struggles in the Hebrew text and in the New Testament resounded with African people because they realized that other people had suffered too. The human condition is no matter who you are, whether you're rich or you're poor, you're going to suffer. Whether you're white or black or Hispanic, whether you have a lot of money or you don't have anything, you're going to suffer. So a great solace to many African slaves was that while they had life, they were going to do the best they can to praise God and to give thanks for whatever they had. So, with these thousands and thousands and thousands of trips across the ocean, the African community in the Americas increased. First, many of them were in the Caribbean and South America, and then the greater majority of them were shipped to the plantations on the eastern seaboard, Virginia, the Carolinas, Florida, Maryland, and they needed the workers now to work the plantations. And so they stopped exporting slaves in the 1820s. There wasn't much traffic anymore. The Middle Passage, the triangle of trade essentially dried up. And the slaves flourished in the Americas, and you didn't have that much of a slave trade presence. So now you have a captured people who were working, a captured people who had been brutalized and were continually brutalized, but were expected to work and to produce. Well, we have a dilemma here. This was a Christian nation set up by Christian men and women, and they had a dilemma. Because when Sunday came and they went to church or they prayed to Jesus, the irony was that they didn't treat the people they owned as well as they should have or could have. And so they used religion in many cases to keep people under control. They used the scriptures to keep the slave obedient to his master and to keep that slave from getting out of hand. So they had to decide how they were going to Christianize them. Were they going to allow them just to have the scriptures read to them, or were they going to allow the African slave to join them in church? In most cases, they did not allow them to join them in church. So white preachers were set up to indoctrinate the large number of African slaves. But very, very quickly, the African slaves had an independent spirit where they wanted to worship the way they wanted to worship. So what they did was they developed a representative, or the black minister, who was appointed and anointed and then was supported in that community to do marriages, if they were allowed to marry, obviously burials, but to do most of the spiritual and teaching in that community. The traditional meeting was on Sunday, and so many slaves were looking forward to Sunday because they didn't have to work. And even if they had to just sit still, that was fine with them on Sunday. It was as Dr. Ephraim says in North Carolina, it was a religious ceremony that was a catharsis. On Sunday morning, they could just, I don't have to work today. And whatever the message was, they were glad to hear it. So they got at least a chance to have a refuge. But they found that most of the slave owners weren't interested in them having a reprieve. In fact, many times when they wanted to worship alone or their own manner, they were invaded. Some of the first meetings where blacks were alone, the whites didn't trust them, and so they'd go into the meetings and beat them or leave someone there to make sure there was no rebellion going on or any plans for rebellion. The church meeting was allowed, and most Africans got a chance to worship God. But when they started to worship alone, they would sing and dance and shout without restriction. They didn't have to worry about what the slave master thought, what the slave master wanted. They were free to worship. So the meeting became a time and a place to get away from white folks. And when white folks allowed them to have their own meeting with their own black ministers, it was a treasured time to relax, to be themselves, even if it was for a short period. There was an institution that was called the Invisible Church, where many blacks wanted to be completely away from the slave owners and those people who controlled them. So they go out in the woods, and they'd pray and they'd sing, and the preacher would bring a message. Sometimes they would just rock and sing together because they were away from their slave owners. Black religious meetings symbolize the ultimate threat for white existence. Can anyone tell me why? Take a guess. Why did it scare them so bad when blacks had their church meetings? Somebody take a guess.
That was the only time they were together without any
Supervision. And so many of the whites were afraid that they were plotting against them. Most of the slaves, if they could have, would have run away. The freedom that they could have experienced, even just for a couple of days, was worth many times the beatings that they took when they were caught or the lives taken, because they lived in horrendous conditions. But many of them wanted to run away. And so in these meetings, we think that it was just a chance to sing and dance. It was a chance to communicate. And in these meetings, there was a coded language. And when they sing about wade in the water, wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water, God's gonna trouble the water. Wading in the water was the pathway through the river so that they could get away. And if you would wade quietly in the water, you would be able to find your way off of the plantation. And it was a coded language for escape. Steal away to Jesus. Steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. That was about getting off the plantation. That was about getting away from the master. Coded language. Many of the songs had to do with communicating things that the slave owner was not supposed to hear. So in 1831, when Nat Turner, a minister, an ordained minister, had his rebellion and got together several dozen people who went and set fire to slave owners' plantations and killed many people, it sent a ripple of fear throughout the South. And a little while after that, they made sure that many church meetings had somebody white there, so that this would never happen again. Denmark Vesey was another slave who, with great religious fervor, wanted his freedom and attacked whites in order that he may be free. So, the church meeting was symbolic of a chance for many blacks, again, to have some privacy, to have cultural restrictions lifted off them. In the white church, you usually had someone who would do hymns and would speak very fervently but very intellectually. In the black church, you had singing, and you had dancing, and you had shouting, and you had people who had a chance to express themselves. And many of the slaves could not do that in the white church, and so they wanted their own church. One of the earliest churches, and some of you may not know this, was Bluestone, or African Baptist Church in Mecklenburg, Virginia, 1758. For some reason, those people were freed. They had their freedom, and so they they got some property and started a church. Now, even though many blacks were not allowed to own property, the church as a corporation could exist. And blacks realized, well, maybe I can't have my own land, but we collectively, as a body, can have this property. And so they established a church. Another church was the first African church in Savannah, Georgia, 1777. Again, they bought property. And for those who even were still indentured or slaves, they attended that church one Sunday. 1790, the first African church in Lexington, Kentucky was established. Again, those people bought that property and owned that church. And those churches were established very, very early. They were rare, but you had a group of people who were very conscious, and they wanted to have not only their own sense of worship, their own sense of pride, but their own sense of community. The church that I was raised in, I brought some of the newspapers, was the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and that again was born out of a chance for African Americans to worship. The African Methodist Episcopal Church was founded by a man named Richard Allen. Richard Allen was a slave, and he was a hard-working young man who saved enough money to buy his freedom and his brother's freedom. That was unheard of. He lived in Endicott, Maryland, and migrated to Philadelphia, where he became very, very enamored with the Methodist Church. John Wesley was an Anglican who got tired of the high church and all the politics, and he developed a thing called Methodism, where people would pray together and sing, they would fellowship, they would read the scriptures, and they would have the practice that Christ would have, people loving one another. And he brought this Methodism to America, and it became very, very popular. Well, many of the slaves saw that many of these people were sincere, and they wanted a part of Methodism. I brought one of my church bulletins. I'll let you look at it when you get done. The Methodists usually had prayer, they had a song, they had a scripture, they had someone to preach it. There was a method to it. They followed that method, and in that method they would change the songs, they would change the prayers, they would change all the aspects, but it stayed in a format that was reliable. So if you were going to go to a Methodist church, you knew you were going to sing, you knew you were going to pray, you knew there was going to be a scripture, and you knew there was going to be someone who was going to preach. Well, Richard Allen liked this Methodism. He joined, and he became very popular. He was an excellent preacher. Sometimes he had to get up at 6 in the morning to preach for the early morning service, but he was excellent. And many people followed him. They followed him to a church called the Old St. George Church in Philadelphia, and their numbers started to grow. Not only was he a good speaker, he was a good missionary. He brought people and said, come to church, learn about God. And they did. And their numbers started to get so large that they outnumbered many of the whites. And the whites became a little bit upset and had them to sit in a certain area. And in that certain area, they were told that they could only sit there. And so one day when they were down praying at the altar, the usher told them, you can't come down here and pray. You have to get up and go back to your area. And Richard Allen said, just let us finish praying and then we'll leave you alone. Well, he got up and took himself out and all the members. And they started a free African society where they could have a chance to worship on their own, where people wouldn't have to tell them where to sit, where they could pray, and when they could do this and do that. They started their own church. The interesting thing about the AME Church is that, again, they followed the best example. Richard Allen bought property. He bought an old blacksmith shop. He had done a lot of blacksmith work, and he knew someone, and he bought the property. Now, before 1800s, for black people to own property in Philadelphia, that's quite amazing. Not only he had the money, but he had the knowledge, and he had the business acumen to do that. So they transformed that blacksmith shop into a church. And he became the first pastor, and then later the bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. I brought the discipline of the AME Church, which is very similar to the Constitution of the United States. Another test. Why do you think it was like the Constitution of the United States? Pick a guess. Where was the church, first of all? Anybody know? So what was going on in Philadelphia in the 1770s and 1780s and what was going on there? They were writing the Declaration of Independence. They were doing the Constitution. And guess what? Many of these writers of the Constitution, many of these writers of the Declaration of Independence had slaves around them. And these free slaves would take the information that they saw from these dynamic people who were getting ready to break with England, and they copied much of the information. So they didn't have to rewrite in formal language anything special. They took a lot of the language of the Declaration of Independence and did their discipline. They were right there. They saw it happening. Some of them may have been servants for some of the fathers of the Constitution and the Declaration. But it was not an accident. So you had a formalized church in Philadelphia that was owned by free blacks, that had a system of government close to ours, and made an impact. Because when people heard about that, they said, we can go now to our church. And they had a chance to go to a church where they could worship the way that they wanted. There was a bishop named Daniel Payne who was in the AME church. And Daniel Payne was an educator, very, very smart man. And what he did was, in 1795, after the AME church was established, there was a thing called the Great Awakening. And you had many missionaries, Baptists and Methodists, who went from the north down to the south to establish churches. Hundreds of churches. And that's what Daniel King did. He went to the south and started planting churches. And those churches grew in number to where they had 60,000 people that were members of the AME church. And it was quite a feat, because now you were having more churches in the south than you had in the north. And it made a great impact on the Great Revival movement, because many slaves did not have a chance again to have a chance to worship by themselves. They were out in the woods, or they were away from the collective. But when these churches started, it gave them stability in their community. When they got to the church, they were given a chance to read. It was against the law in the South for many blacks to read, but in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, reading was a part of what they did. Even if you just sang along in the hymn book, you learned to read. Most of the ministers in the AME church were expected to have a standard of education, their knowledge of the Bible, and running a church that was pretty high. So you had very educated, very intelligent people running churches, and they encouraged their following to do the same thing. So this really brings us to the point of what happened after World War II. Many black servicemen who went to fight in Europe were very successful. They came back overseas with honors and medals, a lot of training. They had a lot of experience traveling in different countries, and actually some of them became leaders. My father was a captain in the U.S. Army. Even before it was integrated, he was a medical person and had training in medicine. So he became a captain, and he had 30 people under him, and they took care of a hospital in Italy where people were wounded. So after World War II, you have all these people who had experiences with war coming back, and they had fought for freedom over in Europe and in Asia, but here in the United States, they couldn't get a job. They couldn't eat in public restaurants. They couldn't go to public events in their own country, but fought for the freedom of this country overseas. And so what happened was, there was a restlessness, there was a stirring of all these talented people who went to war, came back, and could not enjoy the prosperity of this country after World War II. This country became very, very prosperous from 1950 to up until the 70s. The growth went like this. But many African Americans were left out. They did not have a chance to go to educational institutions. Even if they were qualified, many times they could not get a job. They couldn't get basic training. They couldn't get into apprenticeship programs because they were black. So, as we were talking about before I started, there were many people who had fought, tried to get equality, try to get education, try to get a chance in the society that they never had before. But it was time. It was time because everyone else was prospering and the African American was lagging far, far behind. And so you had more and more marches, you had more and more demonstrations, you had more and more violence. And so the civil rights era came in, and it was focused in the black church. The NAACP was outlawed in many places, but people met in church and they signed up for the NAACP. Rosa Parks was an AME, and she was secretary of the NAACP. Simple seamstress, but she had the courage that she had received in her church that God would protect her. And so she courageously helped Dr. Martin Luther King, who was a Baptist, to start the Montgomery bus boycott in the church. Had people known what they were doing or where they were meeting, they would have tried to stop them. So they would meet in one church and then meet in another church. That was the power of the church. And so you couldn't put things in the newspaper about what was going to happen, but it spread through the churches. So when the Montgomery boycott started, people said, you know, those people they're not going to follow through. They're not intelligent enough to organize. They're not courageous enough to see this through. They're not smart enough to make this thing come off. But they did. So in 1955, when the Montgomery boycott of buses started, the word got out through the churches, don't ride the bus. We will walk. And so for a year they walked and did not ride the buses. They had done research that this was probably a good time to attack the white power structure in Montgomery, Alabama. And so it was Rosa Parks who said, I'll do it. I'll go and I'll challenge the laws of Jim Crow and the segregation of this bus company. And they did. Well, that catapulted her and Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement into the limelight. This was the time when television was still in its infancy. But once they saw, the nation saw black churches, black leaders, and people in the civil rights movement fighting, standing up for their rights, it spread everywhere. And again, the institution that kept this going was the black church. You could not organize in the library. You could not organize in the city hall. Sometimes you couldn't go to the restaurant, to the movies, or to whatever hall was in the city. But you always had your church. And again, many times you were not allowed to read. You know, if they caught you reading, sometimes you were killed. Even into the 20s and 30s. But in the black church, when you had to study the scripture, somebody had to be able to read. And so the minister would encourage his flock not only to be courageous and to trust in God, but to read. Get an education. We'll start it right here. Amy Church had, at one time, 6 major black colleges where they encouraged their students to go to school. And I think they have about 5 now. Some of them have fallen on hard times. But if you couldn't get into a white institution, the Amy Church made sure that there was a black institution that you could go to. So it was critical that the African American community had a place to go. The church is not as strong as it used to be. It's getting older. If you look at the pictures in there, most of the people are middle-aged like me are getting older. Still a viable institution. But the world has changed. And so now kids are on devices now, and they don't have to go to church. Or they don't go to church. Or their parents don't go to church. And so the church has another role now as far as what we call liberation theology. But the numbers are dwindling. And so the future of the AME Church or any other black church is a question now. People are trained differently. They're not churched. And so that community that was strong, even from slavery until the 50s and 60s, is starting to diminish. You still have some major churches. You still have people doing outstanding work in their communities. You have churches that feed, you have churches that clothe, you have churches that have credit unions. The larger churches do an excellent job, usually in larger areas. But the collaboration and the coordination, the calculation, the community conviction, even the communication in the black community that used to be in the church is dwindling. But my parents survived, and I survived because of the networking that we had in our churches. I learned to speak before I got to school in my church. When I stood up, they told me, don't mumble, don't stumble, speak loud so people could hear you. So when I went to school, I was prepared. When I was in church, I had to respect everybody, even if I didn't like them. So when I got to school, I had the respect of my teachers and the people around me because I gave them respect. When I went to school, I had an expectation before my teachers told me that I needed to behave and do the best that I could. Well, I learned that when I was in church. I remember when I was 3 years old and was acting up, and the usher came and got me. Just picked me up out of my seat, took me to the back. I didn't know what this lady was going to do to me. I still remember it. She wanted me to be quiet. And I could not go back into service until I was quiet. And when she took me back in, she'd look at me. So all she had to do. So even as a child, a young child, I learned to listen and to be still at certain times. Kids today don't have some of that same training. And because of that, this is a different world that we have. We have a different generation of people who learn differently and think differently and act differently and are not connected the way I was in my childhood. So I just gave you a brief overview of the essence of the black church, the pivotal position that it gave to the African American community, specifically the AME church, because that's where I was raised, and I'm still a part of that church. The AME church has you can't see this too long, but they have memberships in America, they have memberships in Africa, they have memberships in Europe. So there are 22 districts around the world where the AME Church has a conference and where they meet. And so I'm in a church that's a connectional church. I can go anywhere in those connectional churches and speak and work, and I'm licensed to do that work. So it was a universal church for me, and my parents had me to travel and to be a part of that, and I think it's made me a better person. So I'm going to read for you a poem by Margaret Walker, and I want this to kind of act as a summary, just as James Weldon Johnson did. You know, in 35 minutes to give you the whole history of the church and the struggles of black folks, it's impossible. But listen to the quality of this lady's mind and her imagination and her depth of her people. It's called For My People. For my people everywhere singing their slave songs repeatedly, their dirges and their ditties and their blues and their jubilees, praying their prayers nightly to an unknown God, bending their knees humbly to an unseen power. For my people, leading their strength to the years gone and the years now and the maybe years, washing, ironing, cooking, scrubbing, sewing, mending, hoeing, plowing, digging, planting, pruning, patching, dragging along, never gaining, never reaping, never knowing, never understanding. For my playmates, in the clay and the dust, in the sand of Alabama, the backyards playing baptizing and preaching and doctor and jail and soldier and school and mama and cooking and playhouse and concert and store and hair and Miss Chumley and company. For the crammed years, we went to school to learn to know the reason why and the answers to and the people who and the places where and the days when in the memory of the bitter hours when we discovered we were black and poor and small and different, and nobody cared, and nobody wondered, and nobody understood. For the boys and girls who grew in spite of these things to become men and women, to laugh and to sing and to dance and to play and to drink their wine and their religion and success, to marry their playmates and to bear children, and then to die of consumption and anemia and lynching. For my people, thronging 47th Street in Chicago and Lenox Avenue in New York and Rampart Street in New Orleans, lost, disinherited, dispossessed, and happy people filling the cabarets and taverns and other people's pockets, and needing bread and shoes and milk and land and money and something all their own. For my people walking blindly, spreading joy, losing time, being lazy, sleeping when hungry, shouting when burdened, drinking when hopeless, tired and shackled and tangled among ourselves by unseen creatures who tower over us omnisciently and laugh. For my people blundering and groping and floundering in the dark of churches and schools and clubs and societies, associations and councils and committees and conventions, distressed and disturbed and deceived and devoured by money-hungry, glory-craving leeches, prey on the facile force of state and fad and novelty by false prophet and holy believer. For my people, standing still, trying to fashion a better way from confusion, from hypocrisy and misunderstanding, trying to fashion a world that will hold all the people, all the faces, all the Adams and Eves, and their countless generations. For my people, let a new earth arise. Let another world be born. Let a bloody peace be written in the sky. Let a second generation full of courage issue forth. Let a people loving freedom come to grow. Let a beauty full of healing and strength, a final clenching by the pulsing of our spirits and blood. Let the material songs be written. Let the dirges disappear. Let a race of men now rise and take control. Margaret Walker. Any questions that you'd like to ask me about either the black church or my experience being a black minister? Yes, ma'am.
You might have talked about this earlier, but we always hear about the Baptist church.
Yes.
Baptists and blacks. Is there a tension between the Black Baptist Church and the AMEs, or are they together, or are they different?
What does the word church mean? It means body of believers. So you have different traditions. The AME church came out of tradition that was more formal, that focused on education. You had many business people and many leaders who were attracted to the AME church because it had status. The Baptist church generally, at this point, is still the largest black church in America, but it was more charismatic. It was not as formal in its education. It was not as formal in its polity or the way it's run. You have several ministers who are ministers for life. The AME church, they move you around all the time. You're under the bishop. The bishop controls where you go and what you do and how the church is run. And we meet 4 times a year to make sure that everything's right. The Baptist church, Baptist minister's in charge. And whether he's doing the right thing or wrong thing, he doesn't always have to answer to a board or to a group like the AME church. So we were a lot more formal in our organization. And the Baptist church, being more charismatic, was not as disciplined. Not less important, but you had black preachers who did what they wanted to do, when they wanted to do it, and didn't have to answer to people. The AME church, we weren't perfect. Have never been and won't ever be perfect. But if you messed up, they moved you. They took you away from doing damage to that congregation, because you have to answer quarterly and annually. You have to stand before bishop and say, here's what I've done. Here's how much money I made. Here's what we said we were going to do, and here's what we did. It's a lot more formal. It's more accountable. So the Baptist Church had a greater charismatic presence in personality, and did not have some of the formal structures they have in church. Tension? No. Just to be able to survive as a black minister, we found that it would be crazy to fight other churches. It made more sense to work together. That's why the civil rights movement was so effective, because you had churches working together, regardless of denomination. Good question. I love all Baptists and get along with them real well. Anything else? What did you learn, so I can get some feedback? Anybody learn anything today that you didn't know, that you hadn't heard before?
I learned about the founding of the AME Church. I did not know that. As I said, my mother grew up in the AME Church, but her thing was whatever church we were near,
Yeah.
that's where we went.
Yeah.
And we were, so I didn't know about the beginnings of that church. And I was interested to hear about it.
Rich history.
It is. It is.
The blacks in Philadelphia, there was a yellow fever that came through there in the 1800s. And people were afraid and did not touch the dead bodies. The AME Church organized crews to go in and not only get the people who died, but to bury them and keep the spread of, maybe it's cholera, to keep the spread of the disease down. So they were a service church in the beginning, and made a great impact because they just didn't preach, they served. Rich history. The thing I told you about Daniel Payne, he probably recruited more people to join the AME Church single-handedly than anybody I've ever known of. But he organized that and made the AME Church a force in America. So, I had this rich history when I was growing up, and so I had to continue it, and I was responsible for it. I couldn't act a fool because I represented my church and my family.
Well, as I was growing up, like I said, I grew up in the Baptist church. The AME Church always had a reputation in the community as this is a church of educated people.
Yeah.
This is a group of supreme strivers. These are,
Yeah.
and that's the reputation that it had in the community. So why would you not want to be part of that?
Took a lot of courage, took a lot of energy. Today, to be an AME minister, they want you to have a master's degree before you go to the pulpit. They want you to be well trained. Not just a degree now. They want you to go to seminary and at least have a master's. An MDiv, they call it, Masters of Divinity, so that you are well prepared. Because it's not just about preaching anymore. Now it's about leveraging the property you have and the capital that you have. You have to deal with lawsuits. You have to deal with investments. You have to deal with grants and funding from government agency. You have to be pretty sharp. You have to be able to manage people, run several boards, and then again, answer to your presiding elder and your bishop. You have to be pretty well aware of what's going on, because it's not just preaching anymore, it's church management. And the church is a business. It is a business. It's a big business. And you cannot run that, they'll get someone else who will.
I think it's Washington AME Church in St. Louis. I think it's Washington. I think that's the name of it. I'm not sure.
There's a St. Peter's in St. Louis. There's a St. John's in St. Louis that's very, very large. St. Louis was really kind of a heart for Methodism for a long time.
Yeah.
You had many outstanding churches in Missouri.
They had a housing development.
Yes.
And they run several, I don't know, it's not a missionary service. They have food banks,
Yes.
but and they've been buying property.
Yes.
So it's quite a huge operation.
Yes.
I don't know why I'm thinking Washington. Maybe that's the street it's on. I don't know. A friend of mine is one of the musicians there. That's really
This is 1949 in Portland, Oregon. This church was owned by Bethel AME. This is Pastor Hugh. I had just been born. I'm not in the picture. But these people bought this property and maintained it for many years until it was developed by the Portland Trailblazers. They bought our property and built a new stadium there, and we moved and built another church. But that's where I first attended church. 1948 I was born, and attended that church until it was torn down, and then we built another church.
Is that in Portland?
Portland, Oregon.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So travel was nothing to my parents and to me, so I've been all over the place. I've gotten to see an awful lot of life. Largely because the AME Church demanded that you travel. They demanded that you attend meetings. They demanded that you be aware. So I got to meet people from all over the place.
Do they still move you around?
Oh yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
Now, are you at the church on
Fifth and Delaware?
Fifth and Delaware, yeah.
Thank you for your time and your attention.